Got a story for you today about a woman who spent 8 months building something she was genuinely proud of and then had to stand in the middle of it while someone called her a thief in front of journalists, donors, and her own boss. No confrontation, no shouting match, no dramatic speech. Just a timestamp. Whatever you're doing right now, driving, working through your lunch break, half listening while you fold laundry, settle in. This one starts in a museum, and it ends in the same room, and the distance between those 2 points is the most satisfying straight line I've gotten to tell in a while. My name is Nadia, by the way. I'll let her tell the rest herself. My name is Nadia Ose. I'm 31 years old. I'm a senior exhibit coordinator at the Carver Falls Natural History Museum in Ohio. And for 8 months, I lived inside a single project, the way some people live inside a relationship. I thought about it when I woke up. I revised it in the shower. I brought my lunch to my desk 4 days a week because stepping away for an hour felt like abandonment. The project was called Rewilded. The concept, in the most basic terms, an immersive gallery space that walked visitors through the ecological recovery of the Great Lakes watershed over the last 50 years. Not a static exhibit with wall-mounted plaques and taxidermy in glass cases. Something you move through layered soundscapes, shifting light panels, floor-to-ceiling photography printed on translucent fabric, so it moved when you passed through at interactive stations where kids could track the actual migration patterns of species that had come back from near extinction. It sounds grand when I describe it that way, and I don't want to make it sound grander than it was. It was a mid-sized museum in a mid-sized city, and our total budget for the gallery was $310,000, which, in the world of museum exhibit design, is not a number that impresses anyone. But I was proud of it. I was proud of what we'd built inside those constraints. I was proud of the fact that when we ran the soft preview for our education partners 2 weeks before opening, one of the teachers stood at the back of the room and cried. Not because anything sad was happening, just because something was beautiful. I started the project in late February of the year before. Just me and a concept brief. I'd written myself a folder of research documents and a calendar blocked out for the next 8 months. That's important. I want you to remember that. Late February. A concept brief I had written. A folder that existed in our internal project management system dated timestamped with version history going back to the first draft. I'll come back to that. The museum's director is a man named Marcus Adeyemi. He's been at Carver Falls for about 12 years, he cares genuinely about the institution, and he is, I say this with complete affection, absolutely useless in a social crisis. He's the kind of person who, when confronted with conflict in a public setting, goes completely still like a very tall, distinguished man-shaped statue and waits for someone else to resolve the situation. I did not know this about him until the day of the opening. I'm getting ahead of myself. In late April, about 6 weeks into the project, Marcus told me that the board had approved bringing in a third-party design consultancy to help with the technical execution side. Specifically, they wanted someone with experience integrating audiovisual systems into non-traditional architectural spaces because the museum's building was built in 1973 and its electrical infrastructure was politely a deck nightmare. The consultancy was called Adwell and Partners. They sent us one person, a project manager named Pamela Witt. Pamela was somewhere in her mid-40s, efficient, confident, and I can say this honestly because I'm trying to be fair, genuinely good at the technical side of her job. She knew AV integration. She knew load-bearing requirements and cable management and what you could and couldn't do with a building that had been retrofitted for modern electricity 3 times in 40 years. In the 6 weeks she worked with us, she saved us from at least 2 structural mistakes that would have cost us significant time and money to fix. She was also, I realized over those 6 weeks, someone who genuinely struggled with the distinction between executing a creative vision and owning it. It started small. She'd refer to the translucent photo panels as my panel concept in meetings, even though those panels had been in my original design document from February before Adwell and Partners was ever contacted. I didn't correct her in the moment because I thought it was just careless language. She was involved in the execution, and people sometimes blur those lines without meaning to. I made a note of it. Then it started happening in front of other people. She'd be on a call with the AV vendor and say things like what I'm trying to achieve with this space or my vision for the light sequencing. I'd be sitting right there. The vendors would glance at me, glance at her, not sure who to direct their questions to. I went to Marcus about it once, gently. I said I'd noticed some attribution confusion in the way Pamela was speaking with external contractors, and I wanted to make sure the project record was clear about origination. Marcus nodded thoughtfully and said he was sure it wasn't intentional and that he'd have a word. Whether he had that word or not, I don't know. Things didn't noticeably change. Pamela's contract with us ended in mid-June. Her portion of the work was complete, the technical infrastructure was tested and signed off. She had a handoff meeting with our facilities team, she shook hands with Marcus, and she left. I spent the next 10 weeks finishing the project. writing the interpretive text, curating the photography, working with our education team on the interactive stations, coordinating the installation, arguing with the printer about the fabric panels. I also, somewhere in those 10 weeks, did something I hadn't consciously planned. I went back into our project management system. We used a platform called Fieldwork, which logged every document, every edit, every comment, every upload with an automatic timestamp and the username of whoever had made the change, and it organized my project folder. Not because I was worried, just because I'm organized. I labeled everything clearly. I made sure the version history on every core document was intact and readable. I didn't know why I was doing that exactly. It just felt important. The Rewilded opening was on a Thursday evening in mid-October. It was a ticketed event, $35 a head, with about 200 guests, including major donors, a few local politicians, 2 journalists from the city paper, and 1 from a regional arts and culture publication, and a dozen or so representatives from the conservation organizations that had partnered with us on the content. I wore a green dress because the gallery's color palette was green and gold, and I thought it would be funny in a way that only I would notice. The first 40 minutes were genuinely the best 40 minutes of my professional life. People were moving through the space the way I had imagined them moving through it, stopping at the things I had hoped they'd stop at, reading the text I had written. The light sequence was working perfectly. The soundscape, a layered composition of actual field recordings from Great Lakes restoration sites, was at exactly the right volume present, but not overwhelming. Marcus gave a short speech. He thanked the donors, he thanked the conservation partners, he thanked me specifically by name for leading the project from concept to completion. And then about 40 minutes in, I looked up from a conversation I was having with one of the conservation directors, and I saw Pamela Witt walking through the entrance of the gallery. My stomach did something. Not quite a drop, more like a slow, sideways lurch. The kind of physical sensation your body produces when it knows something before your brain has caught up. I hadn't known she was coming. She wasn't on our guest list. She must have purchased a ticket through the public ticketing system. She was wearing a blazer, holding a glass of white wine, and looking around the room with an expression I couldn't read from that distance. I told myself it was fine. She had worked on the project. She was allowed to want to see the finished result. Lots of contractors feel some ownership over spaces they've helped build, and that's not inherently a problem. I went back to my conversation. I didn't look up again for maybe 10 minutes. And then I heard her voice. Not the words, just the register, sharp and carrying in a way that made the nearest cluster of guests turn their heads slightly. And I knew with a cold certainty I couldn't have explained that whatever was happening on the other side of the room was not fine. I excused myself and walked toward the sound. Pamela was standing near the central installation, the anchor of the gallery, a 12-foot column of layered translucent panels depicting the eerie shoreline at different decades. And she was talking to a woman I recognized as one of the journalists from the city paper. Her voice was controlled, but elevated. Not quite shouting, the kind of volume that's louder than it needs to be for the conversation it's supposedly having, because it's actually aimed at the room. Worked on this project for months, Pamela was saying. The core concept, the panel system, the light integration, that was my work. That's my intellectual property. And I'm standing here looking at a plaque with someone else's name on it. The journalist had her phone out. Not recording, I don't think, but her posture had shifted. She was engaged. I stopped about 6 feet away and breathed. I want to be precise about what happened in my body in that moment because I think it matters. My hands went cold. There was a tightening across my sternum like something being pulled taut. I had a completely involuntary image of myself at my kitchen table at 11:30 at night in February, the cursor blinking in an empty document trying to figure out what this gallery was going to be about before it was about anything. And then slowly, like something surfacing, I felt something else. I felt calm. Not the performed calm of someone trying to look composed. Actual calm. Because even in that moment, even with the blood draining out of my hands and the journalist's phone 3 feet from Pamela's face, I knew something Pamela apparently did not. I had receipts. I'm going to let that sit for a second. Because here's the thing about Pamela's accusation, and I want to lay this out precisely because I think it matters to understand what she actually said and what it actually implied before we get to what happened next. Intellectual property claims in the context of creative and exhibit design are genuinely complex. I am not a lawyer. I'm not going to pretend this is simple territory. When a contractor contributes to the technical execution of a creative work, the question of what belongs to whom can be genuinely murky. And there are real cases that go to arbitration, cases that go to court where those lines are hard. Tall, draw. But what Pamela was saying was not a nuanced claim about shared contribution. She wasn't saying, I think my technical innovations deserve more credit than they received. She was saying the core concept, the panel system, the light integration, that was my work. She was claiming origination. And that was a claim I could disprove with a folder. A folder with a creation date of February 23rd, 10 weeks before Adwell and Partners was ever contacted. The question was, how do you prove that right now, in the middle of a public opening event, with 200 people in the room and a journalist's ears turning pink, with the effort of trying to hear everything, I didn't have my laptop, I had my phone, and our fieldwork system had a mobile app. Let me tell you what else was in that room. The gallery, like most modern museum spaces, was monitored by a security camera system. 4 cameras, I knew this because I had coordinated with our facilities team on their placement during the installation to make sure they didn't interfere with sightlines. The cameras fed to a monitoring station near the back of the building, and they also fed via the same AV network we'd installed for the interactive stations to the large display panels we'd set up in the gallery's central corridor for the opening reception. Those panels had been showing a slideshow of the construction and installation process. A kind of how we built it visual story. The panels were still on, the slideshow was still cycling, the AV system was networked, Marcus's laptop, which he'd used for his speech, was sitting on a table near the back wall connected to that network. I walked over to the journalist first. I introduced myself. I said clearly enough for the people standing nearby to hear, I'm Nadia Osei. I'm the senior exhibit coordinator who led this project from initial concept through completion. I want to make sure you have accurate information. Pamela turned to look at me. Her expression shifted surprise, and then something that hardened into resolve. She had clearly expected her conversation with the journalist to remain at a low enough volume that I wouldn't hear it, or that by the time I did, she'd have already planted enough of a seed. Nadia. Her voice was steady. You know what you did. I designed a gallery, I said. I'd be happy to show you the documentation if there's any confusion about the timeline. There's no confusion, Pamela said. I know what I contributed to this project. I know what those panels are based on, and I have documentation of my own. She didn't produce any documentation, but she said it loudly enough that the people nearest to us turned to look. And then a few more people turned. And then because 200 people in a gallery space is a surprisingly small acoustic world, the conversation had an audience. I could see Marcus at the other end of the room. He'd registered that something was happening. He was standing very still. I looked at him, he looked at me. I gave him what I hoped was a meaningful look. Then I walked to the table where his laptop was sitting. Excuse me, I said to the guest, standing nearest the table. Politely, like someone who needed to check something quickly. I opened the laptop, it was unlocked, Marcus had just used it, and the screensaver hadn't kicked in. I opened the browser, navigated to Fieldwork, and logged in with my credentials. Behind me, I could hear Pamela's voice rising slightly. She was talking again to the journalist, to whoever was listening, laying out her version of events. The technical innovations, the panel concept, the vision for the space. I found my project folder. I found the original concept brief version 1, created February 23rd by user Nose1147 PM. And then I did something that, looking back, I think was either the best instinct I've ever had or the most theatrical thing I've ever done, depending on how you look at it. I connected the laptop to the gallery's central display panels, the same panels that had been showing the construction slideshow, and I pulled up the project folder. The slideshow stopped. On 2 large panels in the central corridor of the rewilded gallery, in front of approximately 200 people, the Fieldwork project directory appeared. Clean, organized, clearly labeled, and at the top, Rewilded Exhibit Concept Brief V1.0, created by Nose, February 23rd. I said loud enough to Carrie, if anyone has questions about the timeline of this project, I'm happy to walk through the documentation. There's a moment, and I've thought about this a lot since it happened, where a situation can go one of 2 ways. Either the person who's been making accusations retreats, recognizing that the ground has shifted and we all move on with our lives, or they escalate. I want to be honest, I had no idea which way Pamela was going to go. She escalated. That doesn't prove anything, she said, her voice carrying across the room with a force that made a few guests take a small, involuntary step back. Files can be backdated, document management systems can be manipulated. I want to see the original design files, the concept sketches, the working documents from before your project folder was even created. She said this, out loud, in front of 200 people. She said, I want to see documents that predate your folder. Now I need you to understand what she was asking for, because I think some people in that room missed the precise logical structure of what she had just demanded. She wasn't presenting her own documentation. She wasn't showing her own concept sketches or her own working files or her own version 1 brief from before February. She was asking me to produce evidence of work that in her theory I must have stolen, work that in her theory she had done first, and I had somehow taken and rebuilt into my own project history. But she had not produced that prior work because it didn't exist, and the room was starting to understand that. I watched the journalist's face. I watched her glance from Pamela to the display panel. I watched her write something on her phone taking notes. I realized, not recording. Marcus had finally moved. He was walking toward us from across the room slowly, like a man approaching a car that might or might not be on fire. I said, Pamela, if you have documentation of prior work, I'd genuinely be glad to see it. Do you have it with you, silence? Do you have it on your phone, or did you bring anything tonight? More silence. Because what I have on that display right now is the creation date of my original concept brief. I also have the creation dates of 63 subsequent working documents, all logged with automatic timestamps in our project management system, spanning from February 23rd through October 2nd. And I have the version history, which shows every edit I made and when I made it. If you'd like to review those together, I'm available for that. Pamela looked at the display panel. She looked at me. She looked at the journalist, who was no longer making eye contact with her. And then she did something that, and I don't say this unkindly, I'm just reporting what I saw. She doubled down one more time in a voice that had lost most of its earlier conviction. This is not the appropriate venue to resolve this. I'm going to be filing a formal complaint with the museum's board. That's your right, I said. I want to stop here for a moment because I think this story has a shape that can obscure something important, and I want to name it directly. What Pamela did was embarrassing and it was wrong, and it had real professional consequences for her that I'll get to. But I don't think she was some kind of rare monster. I think she was a person who had worked on a project she genuinely cared about and who had over 6 weeks talked herself into a version of that project's history in which her contributions were larger than they were. That doesn't excuse what she did. Showing up at a public event and accusing someone in front of journalists and donors and 200 guests of intellectual theft without any documentation, without any prior formal communication, without any process, that's not a grievance. That's an attack. And she did it in a space where she calculated that social pressure might make me capitulate rather than push back. She miscalculated. But I want to be honest that I don't think she's evil. I think she's someone who made a very bad decision in a very public place, and I think the consequences she faced were proportionate to that decision, not to some deeper judgment about her character. I say this not because I'm trying to be gracious. I'm genuinely still angry about it in the way you stay angry about things that made you feel publicly humiliated, even when you won, but because I think it's the true version, and I don't want to tell you anything that isn't true. All right, consequences. The moment Pamela walked out, Marcus materialized at my elbow. He put his hand on my arm and said very quietly, "Are you all right?" I said, "Yes." He said, "That was incredibly well handled." He paused. "I'm going to step outside and make a phone call." The phone call was to the museum's legal counsel, I learned later. The journalist from the city paper, her name was Denise. I learned afterward Denise Vaugh came and found me about 20 minutes later after most of the drama had settled, and people had returned to the gallery in the way guests return to a party after a minor scene. She had questions. I answered them factually. I directed her to our Fieldwork Systems public-facing summary documentation, and I told her that if she had further questions, she should direct them to Marcus or to the museum's communications office. The resulting article, published 3 days later in the city paper's arts and culture section, covered the Rewilded opening with what I thought was a genuinely lovely write-up. It mentioned in the 4th paragraph that a dispute arose briefly during the opening regarding the project's creative attribution, and that the museum had provided documentation confirming that the exhibit concept was developed internally by museum staff, beginning in February of the previous year prior to any external contractor involvement. It was one sentence. It was accurate. And it was for anyone paying attention exactly the kind of sentence that ends an accusation. Adwell and Partners Pamela's consultancy had been in preliminary conversations with the museum about a follow-up contract. We were planning a secondary gallery renovation that would have involved similar AV integration work, and Marcus had informally floated the idea of bringing in the same firm again based on their performance on Rewilded. After the opening, those conversations stopped. Pamela did in fact file a formal complaint with the museum's board, as she had announced she would. The complaint was reviewed. The board reviewed our fieldwork documentation, reviewed the timeline, reviewed the contractor agreement that Adwell and Partners had signed, which clearly specified that all creative work product remained the intellectual property of the museum, and dismissed the complaint. The estimated value of the contract that Adwell and Partners did not receive $47,000. I don't know if Pamela intended that as a consequence when she walked into the gallery that night. I genuinely don't know what she was expecting to happen. Maybe she thought I would panic. Maybe she thought the presence of journalists would make me more likely to concede something just to make the scene stop. Maybe she thought her confident delivery would be enough to create reasonable doubt. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that I had spent 8 months building something, and that at some point during those 8 months, for reasons I couldn't fully articulate, even at the time I had gone into our project management system and organized my files. I had labeled everything. I had checked the version histories. I had made sure the timestamps were intact. I don't think I did that because I was expecting Pamela specifically. I think I did it because something in me over those 6 weeks of listening to her described my work as her work had registered a flag, had noted the discrepancy, had filed it quietly at the back of the brain and said, keep the record clean. And so the record was clean, and when I needed it, it was there. 2 weeks after the opening, I got an email. The sender's name was Rhiannon Baxter. She worked as an independent exhibition designer based in Pittsburgh, and she had found my professional profile through the museum's website after reading the city paper's coverage of the Rewilded opening. She had specifically searched for my name after reading the 4th paragraph of that article, the one about the dispute and the documentation. Her email was 3 paragraphs long, polite, careful, clearly written by someone who had been sitting with it for a while before she hit send. The short version, 4 years ago, she had been an in-house designer at a regional science center. Adwell and Partners, specifically Pamela Witt, had been brought in as a technical contractor on a large permanent exhibit she had designed, and at the completion of that project at the opening, Pamela had made very similar claims. Not quite as publicly, it had been a smaller event, fewer journalists, but to enough key stakeholders that Rhiannon had felt the professional impact. She hadn't had the documentation she needed. The original design files had been on a server that the Science Center had migrated during the project, and the creation date metadata had been lost. She hadn't been able to prove it. She had absorbed the damage. And now she was writing to me to ask if I would be willing to share my experience and my documentation with a legal advisor she had since connected with, who was looking into whether there was a pattern here worth pursuing. I sat with her email for a few days. I thought about whether I wanted to be involved. I had what I needed. My documentation was intact. My record was clear. The board complaint had been dismissed. The Adwell contract wasn't happening. I had no outstanding harm to remedy. Escalating felt like it carried a cost, time, energy, the possibility of my name being attached to something contentious for longer than I wanted. I also thought about the Science Center in Pittsburgh. I thought about the server migration that had eaten the metadata. I thought about what it would have felt like to be standing in that room at that opening without the February 23rd timestamp. I wrote back to Rhiannon. I told her I wasn't in a position to be an active participant in any legal process, but that I was happy to share my fieldwork documentation and my timeline with her advisor as reference material. I sent it over. I told her I hoped it helped. I haven't heard anything further from the legal advisor, and I don't expect to. What happens from here isn't really in my hands, and I've made peace with that. What I know is this: I did what I could do within the limits of what I was willing to do, and I shared what I had with someone who hadn't been as lucky as I was. That feels like enough. The Rewilded Gallery runs through the end of spring. The education programming has been fully booked for the next 3 months. Last week, we got a notification that the exhibit had been selected for a Regional Museum Design Award, a citation for innovative use of environmental photography in interpretive design. My name is on the citation. My name and the names of 3 colleagues who contributed to the project. The citation includes a description of the work and its origins. It has a date. And sometimes, not often, just occasionally, I'll come in on my lunch break and stand in the gallery for a few minutes, just to be in the room. Just to feel the light change through the translucent panels and hear the field recordings and watch whoever's in there that day. The school groups, the tourists, the retired couples reading the interpretive text more carefully than most adults read anything. The room exists because I made it exist, and now it's here doing its job, independent of me, independent of anyone's claim over it. That's the thing about building something real. It holds its own weight. As for Pamela, her company lost a $47,000 contract. She filed a complaint that was dismissed. And her name appears nowhere in the Rewilded Gallery because her name was never supposed to appear there. As for me, I slept 10 hours the night after the opening. I woke up and made coffee and sat by my window and thought, I am very glad I organized my files. And then I started thinking about the next project. That's it. That's the whole story. Did Nadia make the right call by letting the documentation speak? Or should she have pulled Pamela aside privately before making it a public moment? I'm genuinely curious where you land on that one. Drop it in the comments. There's a new one up tomorrow. I'll be here.